By the time the wind turned cold, I had nowhere left to go. Only my dog kept walking beside me. Then he stopped, right in front of an old cabin in the woods. I pushed the door open, hoping for shelter before the snow. But when the lantern light touched the wall, I saw a name carved into the wood. My name. Why would a place like this remember me? The cabin smelled like old pine and dust. The wind outside pushed softly against the wooden walls. My dog walked ahead of me, paws slow on the creaking floorboards. He stopped near the fireplace. Then he sat down, like he had already decided this was where we would stay. I set the lantern on the table and looked around. The place was small. One chair, a rough wooden table, and a narrow bed near the window. Someone had lived here once, but not for a long time. My dog sniffed the floor, then looked back at me. His tail moved slowly. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Quiet. Real quiet. I walked back to the wall again. The lantern light moved across the wood, and there it was. The name carved deep into the beam. My name. Not scratched quickly, carefully carved, like someone had taken their time. I ran my fingers over the letters, and one thought came to my mind. Someone had known I would come here. But the question was, who? I stood there for a long moment, my hand still resting on the carved letters. Parker. My dog looked up at me, tilting his head, like he was waiting for me to understand something. I hadn't heard that name spoken in years, not since the town I once lived in had slowly forgotten me. Back then, things were different. I had a small house near the river, a wife who laughed at the smallest things, and mornings that smelled like coffee and pine trees. But life has a quiet way of taking things from you. First the house, then the work, then the people who used to say your name every day. Until one morning, no one said it anymore. I ran my fingers across the carving again. Parker. The cuts in the wood were old, very old, older than the dust in this cabin. My dog suddenly stood up, his ears lifted. He walked slowly toward the back wall of the cabin. Then he stopped and began scratching lightly at the floorboards. At first, I thought he smelled food, but when I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. One of the boards was loose. I knelt down beside my dog. The old floorboard moved slightly under my hand. Not broken, just loose, like someone had lifted it before. My dog watched closely as I pulled it up. Dust rose slowly into the lantern light. Underneath the board, there was a small metal tin. Old, scratched. The kind people used years ago to keep small things safe. My fingers hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were only two things, a folded piece of paper and a small brass key. I unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was old, but steady. Only one sentence was written there. Parker, if you ever come back here, the cabin is yours. My heart slowed, because the handwriting felt familiar. Too familiar. I turned the paper toward the lantern again, trying to read the signature at the bottom, but the ink had faded with time. My dog gave a quiet bark behind me, and when I looked up, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The carving on the wall wasn't the only name in this cabin. I slowly stood up and looked around the cabin again. The lantern light moved across the walls, and now that I looked closer, I could see them. More carvings. Not just one name, several. Old initials, dates scratched into the wood, some so faded they were almost gone. My dog walked over to the corner of the room and sat down again, like he had already chosen his place for the night. The wind outside had grown stronger. Cold air slipped through the cracks in the walls. I hadn't eaten since the morning before, and my hands were starting to shake from the cold. But something about this place felt different, like the cabin had been waiting. Not for just anyone, for someone who knew the name on that wall. I opened the old tin again. The small brass key was still lying there in my palm, and suddenly I noticed something I had missed. On the back of the key, there were tiny letters carved into the metal. 3 of them. P, C, H. My dog stood up again, then slowly walked toward the back door of the cabin, and this time, he began scratching at the wood.
My dog scratched harder at the back door. The wood creaked under his paws. I walked over slowly, the lantern shaking a little in my hand. The door opened with a long, tired sound. Outside, the forest was already turning dark. Cold wind moved through the trees. Snow wasn't far away. My stomach tightened again. I hadn't eaten properly in days. For a moment, I wondered if I should leave, find a road, find a town. But my dog stepped outside, then stopped beside the porch. He began digging at the ground, slow at first, then faster. I knelt beside him and brushed away the dirt. Under the soil, there was a flat stone, too smooth to be natural. I lifted it carefully. Beneath it was a small wooden box, sealed tight. My hands felt colder than before as I opened it. Inside were 3 things: a wrapped piece of dried meat, a small compass, and another folded letter. My dog sat quietly beside me, watching, like he already knew something I didn't. I opened the letter slowly, because sometimes the past waits a long time before speaking again. The paper inside the box was older than the first one. The edges were yellow and fragile. For a moment, I just held it in my hands. The lantern light trembled as the wind pushed against the cabin. My dog sat quietly beside me, waiting. I unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was the same, steady, careful, the kind of writing people used when every word mattered. It said only a few lines. Parker, if you are reading this, it means the road brought you back. I stopped breathing for a moment. Back. The letter continued. You may not remember this place now, but once, it was the only place you ever called home. My dog looked up at me, like he understood something I didn't yet. I read the last line again. Everything you need is still here. You only have to remember where to look. The wind outside grew louder, and suddenly I realized something. If this cabin had once been my home, then somewhere inside it, there had to be more of my past waiting. But the real question was, why didn't I remember any of it? I read the letter again, slowly, trying to understand how a place I had never seen before could once have been my home. My dog walked quietly across the cabin, then stopped near the window. The glass was dusty, but the moonlight outside showed something I hadn't noticed earlier. Behind the cabin, there was an old wooden shed, almost hidden by the trees. The roof was half broken, but it was still standing. I took the lantern and stepped outside. Cold air filled my lungs. The ground crunched under my boots. My dog walked ahead like he already knew the way. When we reached the shed, the door was hanging slightly open. I pushed it slowly. Inside were old tools, a rusted shovel, a broken lantern, and something leaning against the wall, a wooden sign, covered in dust. I wiped it with my sleeve, and my heart stopped for a second, because carved into that wood were the same letters again, Parker, and underneath the name, 2 more words, built by. I stood there in the shed, staring at the words carved into the sign. Built by Parker, not owned by, not left to, built by. My hand tightened around the lantern. For the first time that night, something moved inside me. Not fear, not confusion, memory. Small things at first, the sound of a hammer on fresh wood, the smell of cut pine in the sun, a woman's voice laughing somewhere behind me. I closed my eyes for a moment, and there it was, a younger version of me standing right here, stronger hands, a straighter back, building this place board by board.
My dog pressed gently against my leg, as if to steady me. I opened my eyes again and looked around the shed. There was more here than old tools, more than broken wood. On the far shelf, under a heavy canvas cloth, was a wooden chest, low and wide, the kind meant to keep things for years. I set the lantern down beside it, because if this place had truly once belonged to me, then whatever was inside that chest might explain why I had lost it. I knelt beside the wooden chest. The lid was stiff with age. For a moment, I just rested my hand on it. My dog sat close beside me, quiet, patient, like he understood this moment mattered. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside were old blankets, a wool coat, a tin coffee cup, and beneath them, a bundle of letters tied with faded string. My hands trembled as I picked them up. The first envelope had my name on it, Parker, written in the same careful hand. I opened it and unfolded the paper inside. It was from my wife. The words were short, simple, but they hit harder than the cold ever could. If you ever lose your way again, go back to the cabin. You built it with your own hands, and I left enough there to help you begin again. I stopped reading. The lantern light shook beside me, because suddenly I understood. This wasn't just an old shelter in the woods. It was the place we had once built together, a place meant for one last beginning. And under the letters, there was one more thing in the chest, a folded deed with my name on it. I held the deed in both hands for a long time. The paper was old, but the name was clear, Parker. The cabin had never stopped being mine. I looked around the small shed again, the tools, the chest, the letters my wife had left behind. She had known me better than I knew myself. She knew that one day, life might strip everything away. The house, the money, even my sense of who I was. So she left me this place, not as a memory, but as a way back. That night, my dog and I carried the chest into the cabin. I placed the letters on the table, fed the fire, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man with nowhere to go. I felt like a man who had finally come home. Weeks passed, then months. The roof was patched, the broken fence was raised again. Smoke rose from the chimney every morning, and when winter finally came, the cabin stood warm against the snow. Sometimes life does not return what you lost. Sometimes it leaves you one small door still open. And if you are lucky enough to find it, you walk through. Tell me honestly, if life took everything from you, would you still have the strength to begin again? Or would you keep walking, even if home was right in front of you? And if stories like this speak to the part of you that still believes in second chances, subscribe to the channel. Because some stories are not about losing everything. They are about finding the one thing worth coming back for.